Welcome to Variant, where we love comics more than I think Red Skull is going to be in Infinity War. I'm your host, Aris Quinones. Easily one of the most requested History Of episodes over the past year has been Swamp Thing. So many of you guys have asked for this episode that we've lost count. Well, your time has arrived, my friends. Your months of patiently waiting has paid off, because today, it's all about the Avatar of the Green. Swamp Thing made his debut in House of Secrets issue 92 in 1971, and he was created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. The character has gone through many changes over the years, and the Swamp Thing that first appeared back in 71 is pretty different from the Swamp Thing we're familiar with today. The first or original Swamp Thing's real name was Alex Olsen, but when DC realized that he was becoming a pretty popular character, he was quickly updated by his creators and changed to Alec Holland in Swamp Thing issue 1 in 1972, which of course is the Swamp Thing we are most familiar with today. Swamp Thing's first ongoing series also established a number of mainstays into his mythos, like his wife Abigail Holland and villain Anton Arcane, among others. But it wasn't until his second series, which was originally called The Saga of Swamp Thing, that writer Alan Moore took over the title and transformed Swamp Thing into the amazing character we've all come to know, with one of the most loved and praised runs in comic book history. Speaking of, that leads us to his comic book origin. Now, there have been several different characters that take up the mantle of Swamp Thing over the years, but I'm going to focus on Alex Olsen and Alec Holland as they're the most popular and, in my opinion, the most important when it comes to understanding how the character has evolved over the years. Let's start with the first, and that's Alex Olsen, whose origin is simple yet tragic. Olsen was a young and very talented scientist in Louisiana during the early 1900s, and was married to a lovely lady named Linda. Things were going great for Alex until his best friend and assistant Damian Ridge, who was secretly in love with Linda, planned to kill Alex and use Linda's grief to get her to marry him. So that bastard of a friend messed with Alex's chemicals and caused an explosion in an attempt to kill him. But Alex survived the blast, so Damian secretly took Alex's battered and bloody body deep into the swamp and buried him there. I think you see where this is going. Burying Alex in the swamp is where Damian made a serious mistake, because the mixture of the chemicals from the explosion and the elements in the swamp turned Alex into a humanoid plant, better known as Swamp Thing. However, by the time Alex was turned into the creature known as Swamp Thing, he was too late to stop Damian from carrying out his plan to manipulate and marry Linda. Having said that, Linda was starting to piece together on her own that Damian killed her former husband. When Damian realized that Linda had become suspicious, he started planning to kill her also by using a lethal injection. But before he has a chance, Swamp Thing crashes through the window, saves Linda, and kills Damian for what he did to him and what he was about to do to Linda. He then turns to his former wife with open arms, but not surprisingly, she doesn't recognize him. He tries to talk to her, but he can no longer talk. She just looks at him and screams in total fear. So Swamp Thing does the only thing he can do, and that's walk away heartbroken, but unable to even cry, and returns to the swamp alone as a monster. Sad and messed up, right? But now let me shift gears and give you Alec Holland's origin as Swamp Thing. It's pretty short and sweet though, as it was his mythos and powers that were greatly expanded on. Much like Alex Olsen, Alec Holland was a scientist from Louisiana who was working on a biorestorative formula in his lab when an explosion happened that doused him in chemicals. In a panic, Alec jumped into the swamp and died. Well, because chemicals are the secret ingredient for some sort of powers in comics 9 out of 10 times, Alec later emerged as Swamp Thing. But this is where it gets tricky and his story really expands. Under Alan Moore's pen, Swamp Thing was reinvented as an elemental entity. He was literally described as, quote, a plant that thought it was Alec Holland, a plant that was trying its level best to be Alec Holland, end quote. So what that means, and what we find out in issue 21 of the Saga of Swamp Thing, is that Alec Holland didn't transform into a plant and become Swamp Thing. Instead, after the exposure to the serum, Swamp Thing actually absorbed Holland's body, made a copy of his consciousness, and became Holland. So the reason why Swamp Thing looks humanoid is because it's the plant's attempt to try to look human. And for all of you who aren't familiar with Swamp Thing, it probably just blew your mind to find out that he's way more complex than you may have thought. But wait, there's more. We also find out that there has been a bunch of other Swamp Things before Holland, and that Swamp Things are defenders of the green, which is basically an elemental force that connects all forms of plant life on Earth. This was also Moore's way of explaining the existence of the first Swamp Thing, Alex Olsen. I also want to say that Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing was the first mainstream comic to ditch the Comic Code's authority and explore more mature themes. Which I guess is not shocking because Alan Moore does what he wants, but on that note, story arcs. Swamp Thing has appeared in 5 different self-titled series to date, His first series ran for 24 issues in 1972. Like I said earlier, it was in this series where Abigail Holland was introduced, but also his friend turned enemy, Matt Cable. In the last 2 issues of this series, Swamp Thing was turned back into a normal man and had to fight one of his last villains as just a man. He wins, of course, and the issue ends with a caption saying, "Next issue, Hawkman vs. Swamp Thing," but the series was cancelled before that ever happened. Next, we got the Saga of Swamp Thing series, which gave us the same Alan Moore Swamp Thing run I mentioned previously, starting with issue 20 of the series and running through issue 64. Swamp Thing's third series in 2000 was written by Y the Last Man, Runaways, and Saga writer Brian K. Vaughan. In this series, we find out that Tefe is a human-plant elemental hybrid that has incredible power, and we see her struggling to control it and use it for good or evil. After this, we got Swamp Thing's 4th series in 2004. This series stripped Alec Holland's human consciousness from Swamp Thing, which leads him to seek to restore balance to the natural world by destroying his own daughter, who's a powerful elemental herself. If that sounds interesting, you'd be right. The next major time we see Swamp Thing after this was in DC's Brightest Day event. In this story, the White Lanterns made a new Swamp Thing based on the body of Alec Holland, but this time, instead of just thinking it was Holland, it was actually Holland. Then the New 52 gave us the 5th self-titled Swamp Thing series, where famed Batman writer Scott Snyder essentially gave us the Brightest Day version of Swamp Thing, in the sense that Snyder's version of Swamp Thing was also Alec Holland turned into Swamp Thing and not just a giant plant thinking it was Holland. After that, Swamp Thing got a 6-issue miniseries written by co-creator Len Wein in 2016. And lastly, and most recently, we got an 80-page Swamp Thing Winter Special, which I haven't read all of it yet, but I did read Jason Fabok's portion, and man, is it awesome. Now, with all that covered, let's see what this elemental is capable of. First and foremost, the Avatar of the Green has elemental control. What does that mean exactly? Well, it means that Swamp Thing has complete mastery over all forms of plant life and can command vegetative matter to do what he wishes. Because of this, he's in constant communication with the essence of the earth and serves as the plant elemental for the entire planet. Basically, he makes the Jolly Green Giant look like a chump. Holland has even gained control over earth, water, air, and fire on top of plant life. You know the Benders from Avatar? They've got nothing on this guy. Swamp Thing also has super strength, and since his strength level is directly tied to his connection to the earth, with more power supplied by the green, his strength level is immeasurable. It's kind of ridiculous how strong this guy can be. He's also somewhat immortal. As long as there is some sort of plant life on Earth, Alec will always have a vessel to store his consciousness, again making him nearly immortal. With that said, you can't really kill Swamp Thing either. To kill him, you would have to get rid of all plant life on Earth, which basically just means you have to destroy the entire planet. And unless you're Galactus, why the heck would you do that? One of the scariest powers he has is chlorokinesis, which is a fancy word for being able to talk to plant life and control its growth and form. So not only can he open up the swamp and have it swallow you or have vines tear you apart, but he can also control any microscopic algae inside a person's body and use said algae to attack them from the inside out. Swamp Thing can also grow to massive sizes if need be, as he just draws from the green. In the New 52, he was also able to grow wings and fly. Altogether, he has more powers and abilities than I can even mention, but the point is, he's definitely a heavy hitter in the DC universe. If you want some good Swamp Thing reading, which I'm sure you do, read House of Secrets issue 92, Saga of the Swamp Thing book 1 and 2, Swamp Thing volume 1, Raise Them Bones, Swamp Thing by Brian K. Vaughan volume 1, and Swamp Thing volume 1, The Root of All Evil. First up for Wednesday, March 7th, we have the Amazing Spider-Man issue 797. The Green Goblin is back, and he's scarier than ever. Here we have Venom issue 163. After revelations about Venom's past and questions about his future, a dangerous new adversary makes his presence known in the Marvel Universe. Next, we have Batman issue 42. Poison Ivy has taken over every man, woman, and child on the planet, and only Batman and Catwoman have escaped her influence. And finally, we have Batman White Knight issue 6. Plain and simple, this Elseworld tale is my favorite comic book series currently coming out. So I say, you have to read it. And just like that, that's going to bring another episode of Variant to a close. But remember, links for all our social media, like our Instagram, our Facebook, our Twitter, and our website is in the description below. And if you like today's episode, be sure to subscribe and then hit the bell next to it so you're notified whenever we upload a new video. But I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things comics.